All right, well, I know you've been waiting on the edge of your seat for another one of these. So what I want to do is go through and highlight a little bit of the Barrett book, the one that you're reading about Oman's history, and highlight some things that I think are important to realize. So it says Oman History Part 1. It's true. There will be a Part 2. I guarantee it because I didn't get as far on this as I wanted to. So we will go on to Part 2, but we'll start, of course, with the realization that Oman has always been a tribal country, or at least, for most of its appreciable history. Family units formed tribes. Tribal units are still a very important part, and I'll try to talk about that a little bit more in Part 2. Maybe there might be a Part 3. Anyway, the tribes, these family clans, as they're called in some areas of the world, are an important part of Oman's early development, and in fact its entire development throughout its history. As Barrett points out, Oman has been dominated by the seashore and the inland, and this has actually caused a lot of conflict. The inland and the desert was very insular. The people, the tribes themselves fought with each other, but they didn't have any interaction with the outside world, whereas the people along the seashore were very involved in fishing, shipping, trade, merchandising, and things like that. And so they developed quite differently. And this, over the years, led to some conflicts, and it certainly led to a feeling almost that Oman, this area, was a divided nation. If it really was a nation at all in anything other than name or territory. And I think that's one of the important things to remember. For most of its history, it didn't even think of itself as a nation. Islam really didn't do a whole lot to change that attitude, except that Oman, as this land mass, as this area that existed next to Arabia. It was not Saudi Arabia back then. It didn't become Saudi Arabia until the 1930s. But the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad, who lived in Mecca and Medina afterward, is the prophet of the Muslim religion. And so Islam was founded in Arabia, and Oman was one of the first countries outside of that to adopt Islam. And it's important to point out that we hear today, when we talk about Islam as a religion, we hear about the conflict between the Sunnis and the Shias. Iran being mostly Shia, much of the rest of Arabia being mostly Sunni. And this is an ancient conflict. You can read about that a little bit more. Some of it's explained in some of the things that we have. This is important to remember. But it was yet a third sect that did not believe. Sunni and Shia were created by divisions among people over who would succeed the Prophet Muhammad and his successors, and there became a schism, as there has been in the Christian church over the years as well, and even within Christianity, within the Catholic Church as well. Well, there was a third sect that didn't believe that any family member automatically was an heir to Muhammad. It should not be a family thing. And this became the Ibadi sect. And that is what actually Oman is. Most Omanis are Ibadis. They're neither Sunni nor Shia. They are Ibadis. As Oman became a Muslim nation, there came to be in charge of things the imam, the religious leader, who was in fact elected by senior members, however that was determined, of Muslims there. And he was really just a religious ruler, but in fact he became almost a political ruler. And Oman, the whole area, was under constant threat from other Arab countries, and was under constant threat internally as well. And so there was a whole, we're talking from, the time of Christ up and, and Islam was created. The prophet got the word from God in 639, 640, along in there, some 640 years after Christianity was founded. And so there has been, even before that, but certainly within its history, a whole series of conflicts and death. The first sultan actually is part of this conflict between various rulers, various generals of armies who ousted invaders and things like that, and who fought with, rebelled against some of the oppressive imams that came along. And he emerged in 1748, Ahmed bin Said. Bin is the Arab word for son of. So Ahmed bin Said was the son of Said. Most Omanis can trace their heritage back at least 10 generations. So you would be somebody bin somebody bin somebody bin somebody bin somebody, and it can go back quite a ways. As far as I can tell, the Saids or Al-Busaids, the Saids is the third oldest continuous family line. I'm not quite sure of that, but I think, as far as I can determine, it is. Japan's chrysanthemum throne family line is the longest, goes back centuries, actually millennia. Monaco's Grimaldi family, Prince Rainier was the one that was really well known. He's since died. His son has taken over, and I can't remember his name, but their last name is Grimaldi. That goes back to the 600s, I believe, the 600s or 700s. And then the Al-Busaidi family goes back to about 1748. And as I mentioned, this has been a constant power struggle between the Imam and the Sultan. Barrett talks about that, and it's really easy to get wrapped up in the minutia. But the important thing is to remember this has been constant conflict. Oman was a huge empire at one time, a very large empire. It went all the way from where UAE is now. At one time, they were called the Trucial States, but Oman possessed them all the way down through Oman and down, in fact, to Zanzibar. And so it was a huge empire that was partly made possible by the sailing abilities of the Omanis. They were excellent sailors. They traded all around the world. Well, not all around the world, but certainly around Asia. And many countries came to Oman to trade with them. But there was this constant warring, and then Britain got involved. And that's about the time that Oman's empire began to shrink. Two brothers disputed their claim to be sultan. And so Britain stepped in and said one can be a sultan of Britain, the other can be sultan of Zanzibar. This didn't sit well with anybody, because anyone with any foresight at all could see where this was going to go, and it wasn't going to be pretty. When you have two different people ruling two different lands, they in fact become separate countries, and that's really what happened. Oman, in effect, lost Zanzibar. And today, the Al-Busaidis are not involved in any way with Zanzibar. Now, that connection, excuse me, that connection with Zanzibar was really important, because it was a very important link to Africa. Zanzibar lies off the coast of Tanzania. It is an island. It lies off the coast of Tanzania, and that provided additional trade, a huge, enormous trade route, including slaves. It is an embarrassing fact that Oman did not outlaw slavery until the 1960s, and I think that's an important thing to note. But this was a very important trade route, and a lot of Tanzanians and Zanzibaris came to Oman, and you will find in Oman quite a varied racial makeup. It is quite diverse, and you will find very dark-skinned and very light-skinned Omanis and it is because of this link. Other UAE nations, other Arab nations don't have that among their citizens. Now, certainly most of them have expatriate workers that come from Africa, from India, from Pakistan, and those places. But as far as the citizens of the countries, in most Arab countries, it is fairly homogeneic, not so much in Oman. And it's because of this tie to Africa that it had been at one time traditional. Towns and villages were actually dominated by one tribe or another, and they were constantly raiding another town. And people identify themselves by tribe. I am an Alawati, I am an Al-Mashaki, or whatever your tribe was. They did not identify themselves by region or even by nationality. They did not call themselves Omanis. And all over the country, still existing today, are these old stone watchtowers, very much like this one. And you see them everywhere. And 50 years ago, there would be somebody in there watching for a raid from somebody from the neighboring tribe. They were manned all the time because you never knew when the raid was coming, day or night. And now they're all abandoned, which has been a remarkable a change from what it was at one time. Obviously, oil figures heavily. Oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia in the 1930s. Exploration went on throughout the Middle East for oil. And especially after 1950, Oman comes under the influence of the pressure to develop its oil stocks. But even then, as Oman began to sell oil, it was a very, very backward country. The Sultan was named Said bin Tamer, and Said was not a particularly good man. There was no education. There were 3 schools in the entire country of Oman, and they were all Quran schools. There was absolutely no health care. There was one hospital, and it was way in the south in Salalah, where the Sultan lived at the time. There was actually no infrastructure at all. There was no fresh water. There were 6 miles of paved roads. All the rest were, cattle paths and things like that. And Sultan Said actually controlled all entry and exit visas. If you wanted to leave, even if you were a citizen, you had to get permission from him. To get back in, you had to get his permission. And he hated anybody. He was suspicious of anybody who had an education. And so if somebody left to get an education, that person might not even be let back in. So that's the part 1 of the history. It takes us up to the time that Sultan Qaboos bin Said, son of Said, seizes power. And I want to talk about that in the second part, which will be done soon. So this is the first part. I hope it doesn't, I don't think it clarifies the book, but it highlights a few things that I think you need to know. And so stay tuned for part 2.